What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and it is time for another album ranking. It's been about 3 weeks or so since we did the Metallica one, which got quite a bit of reception. Granted, not nearly as much as the Morbid Angel one, but either way, I'll take any kind of reception I get. Thank you all so much. And after the Metallica video went up, I put up a poll asking from you guys what band would you guys like to see me talk about next, and it was all black metal oriented. So you had Bathory, Emperor, Enslaved, Immortal, and Mayhem. And by a wide margin, you guys spoke up, and the band we're talking about is none other than arguably the true pioneers of black metal, Bathory. So, Bathory has been a long time coming for me to talk about on this channel, considering that, of course, they're arguably considered the pioneers of black metal as a whole. Now, of course, I'll get into that debate when we get into the early history of the band, but how I got into Bathory, well, this was after high school. After I graduated high school, I was getting more and more into even more extreme metal. Like, I was already into death metal and some grindcore early on, but then around, I want to say like somewhere between like 2013 and 2015, I had started to slowly get a little more into black metal. Black metal was always, I thought, a genre I would never get into, but then after listening to stuff like Darkthrone and Mayhem and Emperor and Immortal, then I went back and discovered the roots of it all from Bathory, and I will say Bathory, in my opinion, the greatest black metal band to ever exist. Without Bathory, you would not have Norwegian black metal, you wouldn't have had bands like Sarcophago, you would not have had a lot of bands that came out in the wake of Bathory's success. So, now to the big debate. It's been a long debate as to who truly invented black metal. Was it Bathory? Was it Hellhammer? Was it Venom? For me, Venom, you could say, was like a proto-band. To me, Venom has always been straight-up speed metal that felt like a more heavier, raw version of Motorhead, in all honesty. Hellhammer, I kind of view them as being a little bit more in the death metal side, with some of the production values of what black metal would become. For me, Bathory was the first real black metal band that invented that vocal style, the high shrilled scream that pretty much every black metal band that followed would take up on. So for me, at least, Bathory was the true inventors of black metal. Not Venom, at least to me. Venom, definitely a predecessor for sure, a proto-black metal band, but in terms of like proper black metal, it's Bathory. You can debate that in the comments if you want, you can agree or disagree, whatever you decide. But with that said, let's get into the early history of the band. So, Bathory formed in 1983 out of Stockholm, Sweden, with their original lineup consisting of Fredrik Melander on bass. He was in the band up until around early 84. We have Bjorn the Animal Christensen, who was the original vocalist who left pretty much in the same year they formed in 83. Jonas Åkerlund on drums, and of course Jonas Åkerlund is a name pretty familiar to a lot of people because really after he left Bathory in early 84, went on to become a music video and film director and has had a lot of success. I could go on with that. And finally rounding out with the founder of the band, Thomas Quorthon Forsberg on guitars. So this lineup only lasted for probably a few months because later in 83, Bjorn left the band, leaving Quorthon to take up on vocals. But then in early 84, both Fredrik and Jonas would leave the band, and then as a result, Quorthon would end up getting 2 new members. Well, actually 1 member and a session member, because now we are going to get into the albums, and we're kicking things off with their debut in 1984, Bathory. So for the lineup here, you have Quorthon on vocals and guitars, Rickard Ribbon Bergman on session bass, and Stefan Larsson on drums. So, the self-titled debut from Bathory, this is my number 4 album. Holy shit, what an awesome debut. It's short, sweet, to the point. It's like only like 27 minutes, if that. But all these songs are just like party anthems with that evil satanic edge of Venom. And of course, there's that other thing. Like Quorthon for years would deny being inspired by Venom. Yet Jonas Åkerlund clearly said he was inspired by Venom. But that's another story for another time. But yeah, it's like this album sort of mixes the, like, fun, evil, satanic side of Venom and mixes it with a little bit of, like, the Bay Area thrash scene, like Metallica and Exodus and those kind of bands. Kind of like a hybrid of the two, because this album is very thrashy, very speed metal inspired, but for the black metal that's attached on here, tracks like Raise the Dead, which I think was like the first true, or one of the first true black metal songs, along with, say, Buried Alive by Venom and so on and so forth. But yeah, this album, while not the greatest in terms of production, it's very raw, but I like it for that reason. It just gives it that kind of like punk rock energy to it. Of course, tracks like Hades, Sacrifice, they're top to bottom, this album is absolutely fantastic. It's just fun, it's energetic, and this would really be the one album in their discography where they pretty much had that kind of party vibe to it, because then after this album, things changed drastically real fast. But yeah, the self-titled debut from Bathory, my number 4. So, early on, the band did perform live, but then somewhere in like 85, 86, that time frame, Quorthon decided to not really perform live for the band because he figured out early on that trying to book concerts was a bit of a hassle back in those days in the Swedish scene. So they only played live like in their early days and not really doing anything afterwards, so thought I'd throw that in there. But because of that, Andreas Johansson, I forget, he would come in to become the new bass player since Rickard was only in for the session bass on the self-titled debut. Stefan Larsson still on drums, Quorthon vocals and guitar, and in 1985 would release the follow-up, The Return. This is my number 6 album. I think this is a worthy follow-up to the self-titled. However, I don't think it's as good as the self-titled, but it's still a great album. Definitely the production amped up just a little bit, like the guitar tone is a little bit more forward on this album. The drums, like the drum tones, definitely change. Though the production at times is like the drums kind of do overpower the guitars a little bit, especially in like the really fast, thrashy or black metal sections. So that was a bit of an issue. Also, Quorthon's vocals, I thought, got better on this album. And of course, you even get a couple of tracks where he's doing death metal vocals, especially in tracks like Reap of Evil, where you hear his vocals go really low in the register, like to the lowest possible depths at the time. And really the big issue with this album is sometimes the songs get a little bit sloppy, especially with the drums. Like sometimes, especially on tracks like Reap of Evil in particular, even though I like it for that reason, sometimes the beat and the riff would sometimes be off from each other by a little bit, and you can definitely tell that they were trying to correct it as they were recording this, but it adds to the charm of that raw energy that this band had. So I kind of like it that it's a little bit sloppy at times, because it's like the honesty of the music. It's like, we fucked up, but hey, maybe people will like it. And I did like it because I thought it was kind of funny. But other great tracks like Total Destruction, Possessed, Born for Burning is another staple to black metal to this day. Absolutely fantastic album. Granted, not as good as the debut, but it's a worthy follow-up if you ask me. So, after The Return came out, Stefan Larsson would end up leaving the band in 86, same with Andreas, leaving Quorthon by himself for a little bit. However, would eventually pick up a new drummer, Paul Palle Lundberg, to be on drums, and he would last in the band until the end of '87. Quorthon, for this next album, would do the vocals, guitars, and the bass, and also keyboards. And released in 1987, we get an absolutely legendary album, Under the Sign of the Black Mark. This is my number one. I kind of knew this album would be my number one going into it, because holy shit, I will say the best black metal album of all time. And this album, it's like the self-titled debut was kind of like a good, like, foundation. The Return kind of expanded on that foundation, and then their sound was solidified with this album, with Under the Sign of the Black Mark, because pretty much this, as well as the other big black metal album of '87, Sarcophagus INRI, pretty much set the blueprints for the entire Norwegian scene. Like, even Mayhem was, yeah, they were doing stuff around the same time, but they were kind of doing more of a different thing than what they would eventually become. Like, they were more grindcore, death metal inspired with black metal vocals, more or less. But here, with Under the Sign of the Black Mark, it's like, holy shit, you get everything you love about black metal. You get the crazy black metal static blast beat that bands like Dark Throne would pick up on whenever they would form. Haunting, like, keyboards that just add to the darkness and the evil atmosphere. And that's the key word with this album. Tons of atmosphere on here, especially in, like, the slower tracks, like Call from the Grave, which is another staple to black metal. But other tracks like Massacre and, I can't pronounce the name, Equimanthorn, I think that's how you say that, where they get very, very fast, especially with those blast beats and the tremolo riffs. But of course, the big highlight, Enter the Eternal Fire, the greatest black metal song ever written. It's this, like, big, like, mid-tempo doom march, and it's just evil, it's epic. Like, the leads on that track were just insane. Quorthon's vocals going wild all throughout the album itself. And it was the last of their, quote, satanic days, because their lyrical themes would change quite a bit after this album. But yeah, in terms of influence, importance, and the quality, this is the best black metal album ever released. And if people say one is better than this, they're wrong. Wink. But yeah, because without this album, who the hell knows what would have happened as far as black metal as a whole goes, because, like I said, this album laid the blueprint for the entire Norwegian scene that followed not too long after. So yeah, my numero uno. So after this album, Paul would leave the band, and then in early 1988, we would actually get a stable lineup for a long time. It would be from here until the mid-90s. We get the same lineup going forward. So in walks Kothar on bass, I don't know his real name, and Vornth on drums, who, again, don't know his real name, but they would come in to help out Quorthon in terms of, like, helping him cut some slack from having to do too much in the studio. And, like I said, lyrical themes, we were about to get a big changeover after Under the Sign of the Black Mark. And released in 1988, we get Blood, Fire, Death. This is my number 2 album. I would say it's almost just as good as Under the Sign of the Black Mark, but like I said, lyrically, this is where we get into the Viking era of the band. Basically, Quorthon was growing tired of the whole satanic lyrical content, because he even felt that by 1987 it was completely played out, so he wanted to explore different lyrical themes and tell more stories. And because Bathory, being a Swedish band, Scandinavia, home of Vikings here on Earth, and Norse mythology and all that stuff, he decided to adapt Norse mythology, Vikings, and tales and storytelling into his lyrics going forward. Well, for most of the rest of the albums. We'll get to a couple of those other ones later. But with Blood, Fire, Death, yeah, musically it signaled a big change. this was starting to move away from straight up black metal. Like, this is still very much a black metal album, but even on a couple of tracks, in particular, A Fine Day to Die and the title track, you could hear where they was going to go from here on out for the most part, and that's the more classic heavy metal, folky, doomy stuff. And those two tracks are masterpieces, and they bookend this album beautifully. In between those tracks, the rest of this album is much more thrash-oriented. Like, it kind of almost went back a little bit to the self-titled and the return in terms of the more thrashy side, but making it even more out of control on here. Tracks like Golden Walls of Heaven, Dies Irae, Pace Till Death, like, just thrashy barn burners all throughout this album. And even in the production, it almost kind of equaled the production values of Under the Sign of the Black Mark. However, I think the drum sound on this album was much better, and the guitars were a little bit more prevalent over the drums this time around, so that definitely helped because you could actually hear everything this time. And Quorthon's vocals, I thought, improved a little bit in terms of his, like, black metal vocals, but you also hear him doing clean vocals, particularly in the title track. And I actually like Quorthon's clean vocals. I think he's actually a really damn good singer. And while there was only a few lines of clean vocals on this album, and it was only in the title track, I thought they were great. But yeah, top to bottom, this is a masterpiece of black metal and signal where they would go from here on out. Well, except for 2 albums. But not long after Blood, Fire, Death, the band was actually already back into the studio. However, this album would not be released till later on, and we'll talk about that album when we get to it. But then in 1989, the band would once again go back to the studio to work on something that would change their destiny forever. And released in 1990, we get Hammerheart. Now, this is another giant shift in the sound, whereas Blood, Fire, Death kind of signaled where they was going to go, especially with A Fine Day to Die and the title track. Basically, what they were going for with classic metal, folky, doomy stuff, they pretty much solidified that here with Hammerheart. Gone is the black metal. No black metal vocals. It's pretty much either like more shouted or proper clean vocals on this album. And this is my number 3. I think this is another masterpiece. 1990, one of the best albums of that year. And while I like the black metal era of Bathory, there's a part of me that might like the Viking era a little bit more, just because much more songwriting maturity in the Viking era albums. Now, of course, this led to them being considered the first quote-unquote Viking metal band, which I've said before, and I'll say it again, Viking metal is not a real genre. Because if Viking metal is considered a genre, how? Because there's no uniform sound with everybody. Like, Bathory does not sound like Amon Amarth. Unleashed doesn't sound like Enslaved. Like, it's not a genre, it's just a theme. It's just Viking themes, that's all it is. So I don't even consider Viking metal to be a real genre. Same with, like, Christian metal or gent. I could go on, and I digress. But Hammerheart, I thought, was a brilliant album. Songs like Baptized in Fire and Ice, Father and Son, and then probably one of the most beautiful songs ever written was Song to Haul Up High. Such a beautiful, like, Viking ballad, and Quorthon's cleans shine through so well. And then you get to the final 2 tracks, which I think were 2 of the best songs the band ever did. Home of Once Brave, and especially One Road to Asabe, which was their only music video, and it's a fantastic music video too. I'd suggest you guys go check out that music video if you haven't seen it. But yeah, like I said, musically, very much classic heavy metal, with some folk inspiration, and a little bit of like doom marches going on. Yeah, definitely no more thrash, at least for a while. No more black metal. Basically, we're going classic metal from here on out. Again, except for a few albums. But yeah, Hammerheart, my number 3. So, not too long after Hammerheart was released, the band would once again go back to the studio, and they were about to record what they initially thought was going to be their last album. There was discussion that this next album was going to be it for Bathory. But thankfully, we got more material to come afterwards. And released in 1991, we would get Twilight of the Gods. This is my number 5 album. Again, almost just as good as Hammerheart. I think this was a perfect follow-up to Hammerheart. Although this time around with Twilight of the Gods, the folk and the more doomy side of Hammerheart was more emphasized on here than it was on Hammerheart for me. You know, you got tracks like the title track, Through Blood by Thunder. I think that was the title, I forget. But the main standout for me, and maybe my favorite Bathory song of all time, well, next to Enter the Eternal Fire, Blood and Iron. That song is a 10-plus minute masterpiece. Starting off with these beautiful classical guitars, and then into some like doomy riffs, great clean vocals, beautiful acoustic work. I just absolutely love that song. And then you get other great tracks like the song Hammerheart, To Enter Your Mountain. Like, again, top to bottom, this is a masterpiece of music. Like, I almost wanted to put this higher on the list, but then I forgot. Well, yeah, you got the self-titled and Blood, Fire, Death, but yeah, this, I mean, almost like from 2 to 5, it's like I could arrange them in any order and it wouldn't be wrong for me. Well, actually, no, 3 through 5. I think Blood, Fire, Death should be number 2 for me, at least. But Twilight of the Gods, mwah, perfect follow-up to Hammerheart, in my personal opinion. So, like I said, originally this was thought to be the final Bathory album ever done, and the band took a bit of a break in like 92 and 93. However, they would get back together in the studio in late 1993, and we're about to enter a very divisive period for Bathory. Released in 1994, we would get Requiem. Of course, like I said, this and the follow-up is considered the most divisive period in Bathory's career because pretty much gone from black metal, and they even moved away from like the classic metal Viking stuff. Here, they were going back to being more of a thrash band, and it got a lot of mixed results from some people. However, while I have Requiem at number 11 on my list, I will say it, I think this is a good album. I don't think it's a great album per se. I think it's a good album because the thrashy energy on this album is infectious. Like, holy shit, there are awesome riffs on this album. It just falls towards the bottom just because their other albums just blow it out of the water. But in terms of like their thrash metal side, this I thought was their best work because less cheesy lyrics. Vocally, I will say, Quorthon trying to do like higher shouts, not the best. Honestly, I feel like he should have done death metal vocals and done like a death thrash style, and I think it would have been better. And also the production, not the greatest. Like, I wasn't a big fan of the drum sound. The guitar tone I actually liked. It kind of carried the guitar tones of Hammerheart and Twilight of the Gods, but writing thrash riffs. I don't mind this album at all. I know a lot of people shit on this, and especially the follow-up, which I will talk about in just a moment, but I think people should give them another shot because, yeah, is it the same quality as the remainder of their albums? Absolutely not. They're kind of in a league of their own, essentially. So, yeah, while it's my number 11, I think it's a good album. Just some tweaks could have been done, like Quorthon should have done death growls, the drum sound could have been a little bit better, and the lyrics could have been written a little bit better too. But musically speaking, I think it's a good album. say what you will in the comments below. I know you will. But yeah, my number 11. And then after Requiem came out, the band would once again go back to the studio to continue in this thrash metal sound, and released in 1995, we would get the follow-up, Octagon. While this is my number 12, it's my last place album, and I've seen a ton of negative reviews on this album. However, I'm going to say it right now, I think this is another decent album. I think it's a decent album. I don't think there's a bad Bathory album. I know I'm probably going to get flamed in the comments for saying that, but Octagon, really the only issues I have with this album is kind of the same issues as I had with Requiem. Not the best vocal performance, but definitely not bad. It's just not that great. The lyrics, yeah, a lot of the lyrics on this album were fucking dumb, especially the song 33 Everything, like, dumb as fucking fuck. But, musically, there's a ton of brutality on this album. It's so energetic. And again, me being a thrash fan, I actually kind of like this album because of the thrashiness. Granted, like I said, kind of the same thing with Requiem. I would have just rewritten the lyrics to be more serious or more angry, but not in like a fucking teenage angst sort of way. And then also, like, the drum sound, I kind of compare the drum sound of this album to the From the Past cover album in 96 from Vader that came out a year later. Like, honestly, like, Requiem and Octagon almost feel like the best albums Vader didn't write, because they're very similar to each other and similar to Vader's work in that more high-speed thrash stuff. But again, like I said, with Octagon, lyrics were dumb on a good chunk of these songs, and some of the production choices could have been tweaked a little bit better, but riffs all over the place on this album. There were some awesome riffs on here. It does rank at the bottom just because, yeah, the lyrics and some of the vocals kind of killed it for me. But I still recommend people give this and Requiem another shot, because yeah, if you can get past the lyrics and the vocals and just focus primarily on the music and the instrumentation, it's good stuff. It's just some aspects brought them down a little bit, for me at least. So, after Octagon came out, the band was actually kind of done in late 96. However, in late 95, early 96, now we kind of go back a little bit to like late 88, early 89, because remember when I was talking about earlier that they were working on an album, but they scrapped it, and it wasn't even properly done, so they took some of the master tapes, I think actually all the master tapes, from that session, reworked them in this time period in the mid-90s, and would actually perfect this album and get it released in 1996. And released in 1996, we would get Blood on Ice. This is my number 7 album. This is another fantastic album, and this was kind of like the bridge between Blood, Fire, Death and Hammerheart, especially because, like I said, this was recorded in between that time period, like, well, most of it, but Quorthon decided to scrap it because he was afraid of the reception it would get after Blood, Fire, Death came out, and he also wasn't happy with how it was coming together at the time, so he and Cathar and Vornth would end up reworking a lot of this stuff and re-recording a good chunk of it in this time period. And yeah, this definitely sounds like a proper transition album between Blood, Fire, Death and Hammerheart in terms of going from black metal to the classic metal, folky, doomy stuff. And while I will say between, like, Hammerheart, this album, and Twilight of the Gods, it definitely is the weakest out of the three, but it's still a fantastic album. Tracks like the title track, Revenge of Blood on the Ice, The Lake, there's some, and The Woodswoman, there's tons of masterful songs on here. Granted, I feel like sometimes the vocals were a little bit buried behind the drums, and even the guitars I thought were a little bit buried at times. Like, perhaps some of the knobs could have been tweaked up a little bit to make everything sound more cohesive, I guess would be the right word to say, but still, this is a fantastic album in terms of songwriting maturity. Of course, the storytelling aspect definitely sells this album for anybody who's into, like, Viking heritage and metal lyrics. So yeah, my number 7. Now, after Blood on Ice came out, Kothar and Vornth would end up leaving the band, leaving Quorthon by himself. And Quorthon would end up pretty much doing all the instruments and most of the production. And I forgot to mention that pretty much all these albums, except for a couple, were actually co-produced by Quorthon's father, Bjore Boss Forsberg, who ran Black Mark Productions, which was a bit of an unsung hero record label out of Sweden that had Bathory, but also had bands like Necrophobic and Edge of Sanity. So, kind of a little history there for you right there. But Quorthon would end up learning how to play drums and would actually do, like I said, all the instruments going forward on the remaining albums. And there wouldn't be another Bathory album until 2001, and released in 2001, we get Destroyer of Worlds. This album is odd. This is an odd album. It's my number 10. I think this is a solid album for the most part. It's just... I say it's an odd album because this was kind of mixing the thrash metal albums of, like, Requiem and Octagon and mixing it with their Viking era. And it just was an odd contrast. Like, you got pretty much, like... This album was almost, like, 55% thrash, 45% the classic metal Viking stuff. And it was a weird mix. But the production, I actually kind of liked the production on here. Like, the guitar tones were fucking thick on this album. And, like, the Viking songs were beautifully crafted. A couple of the thrashy songs were really good. The biggest problem I have with this album, there was way too much filler on this album. Not all the songs were that memorable to me. And some of them just kind of... And some of the songs would kind of... And this was kind of an issue as well with Requiem and Octagon. Some songs would end up just quitting and kind of left a bit of a jarring feeling to them. Destroyer of Worlds kind of fixes the sudden stop moments, but a lot of the material on here was not written the best. I think if they would have trimmed the fat on a couple of these songs and, like, shortened... Like, this album's well over an hour, and not all the material was interesting enough, to me at least. I feel like if they would have taken, like, 20 minutes off of this album, I think it would have benefited it a lot more, and I think it would have gone up higher on the list if some of those things could have been worked out. But it's not a bad album. It's actually a pretty good album. It's just too much filler, could have trimmed the fat, shortened it down, and I think it would have been better. But not long after Destroyer of Worlds came out, Quorthon would return to the studio, and he had an ambitious concept in mind. He basically wanted to get away from the thrash metal roots of Bathory and focus more on the classic metal, folky, doomy Viking stuff from Hammerheart, Twilight of the Gods, and Blood on Ice, and really embrace it a lot more. Now, this was originally going to be a 4-part series that ended up getting cut short because of something that happens a few years later. So we only got half of this story, but we would get 2 parts of the story, and I might as well talk about them together because they're basically a pair. First part released in 2003, and then part 2 in 2004, we get Nordland 1 and Nordland 2. Nordland 1 ranks as my number 8, and Nordland 2 ranks as my number 9. Yeah, they're in the back half, but really from these albums, Blood on Ice, The Return, Twilight of the Gods, self-titled, Hammerheart, Blood, Fire, Death, and Under the Sign of Black Mark are all great albums. And honestly, between The Return and Blood on Ice and the Nordland albums, I could rearrange them in any order depending on my mood and my tastes. But both of these albums are fucking masterpieces as well. Definitely embracing, again, that classic metal, folky, doomy side of their sound, and able to craft beautifully textured songs. Like the opening track on Nordland 1, like those riffs, oh man, they kind of scream early Opeth for me. And it's just beautiful, beautiful stuff. And I might as well look up what that song was called because I forgot about it off the top of my head. The title track. Yeah, the title track. Great riffs. And also in terms of like heaviness, these albums are amongst the heaviest Bathory albums. Like, the melodies are beautiful, but the heavy riffs, when they get heavy, they get fucking vicious. And also, I thought vocally, this was maybe Quorthon's best vocal performance in terms of his cleans consistently. Like, you don't really hear him going too far into the shouting range. Like, he's definitely more doing melodic singing on both of these albums. And yeah, while he was older at this point, I thought his voice was aging very well by these two albums. But yeah, as far as which I like out of the two, obviously from the ranks, I like Nordland 1 just by a tiny bit. And I would have been curious to hear what parts 3 and 4 would have been had circumstances not happened. But these two albums, perfect pair, absolutely beautiful Viking tunes. Two albums that I feel get very overlooked. Like, when it comes to Bathory fans, it's like people just want to listen to like Twilight of the Gods back and don't really listen to anything afterwards. I suggest checking out the rest of the albums because you might be surprised. I know I was when I listened to the thrash albums because I knew people didn't like them, but I actually liked them for different reasons. And then listening to these two with the Nordland albums, it was like, man, it's like, yeah, they're long. They're both an hour plus long. But unlike Destroyer of Worlds, I thought the material this time around, like, these albums demand your attention. And nothing more, nothing less I can say. Love them. Now, the reason why I say that 3 and 4 got cut short is because, unfortunately, in 2004, not too long after Nordland 2 was released, Quorthon unfortunately passed away in his apartment in Stockholm due to heart failure. And it was a big shock because, according to a lot of people, Quorthon was a hell of a nice guy, a talented musician, standout human being, and he is sorely missed. And I'm curious to know what would happen with Bathory if Quorthon was still alive. Obviously, we would have gotten the remainder of the Nordland series, and it would have been incredible. But we are left with a legacy unlike any other. I kind of view Quorthon's legacy to metal kind of mirroring Chuck Schuldiner from Death. Like, both were pioneers in their individual genres, both talented musicians, talented songwriters, and left paralleled legacies behind for extreme metal fans, or metal fans as a whole, and bands. And they're both deeply, sorely missed, and it's unfortunate the world's worse without them. But yeah, that, as far as the legacy of Bathory as a whole, going back to what I was talking about in the beginning, they changed a lot about metal. Obviously, the first proper black metal band. Without them, the Norwegian scene wouldn't have happened. And of course, whenever they went down the more classic, folky, doomy side of their sound, they were able to write mature, beautiful songs. And even their thrash metal side in the mid-90s, I thought was fun. Despite some of the lyrics being dumb and the vocal choices, I actually liked those albums. And then ending off with two masterpieces. I mean, despite it not being a finished project because we were missing two other albums, still, I think Bathory left on a high note, on an amazing note, and I can't say anything else. Basically, all hail Bathory, all hail Quorthon. We miss you. We wish you were still here today. But anyways, that does it for my ranking of Bathory albums. This was kind of tough because such a diversion in their legacy, like black metal, classic metal, thrash, kind of all over the map, honestly. But what would you guys rank these albums? Show me your rankings in the comments section below. And as far as what I'm going to be covering next, well, I put up a poll not too long ago, and it's looking like we're going to be doing Asphyx. And I am so looking forward to that because Asphyx is one of my favorite bands ever now. So definitely looking forward to doing that. But that will be coming out towards the end of the month. But until then, horns high, and I will see you guys soon. At number 30, we have Dream Theater's A View from the Top of the World. Yeah, this is probably, in my opinion, the best Dream Theater album since Octavarium, and that was 16 years ago when that album came out. I think it's that good. Like, it's also more riff-oriented for me than most Dream Theater albums as of late. I thought this was a little bit better than Distance Over Time, way better than the Astonishing. Hell, if there's an album in my collection I would sell first, it would be The Astonishing. I did buy it when it came out, and yeah, I haven't gone back to it really at all since, except for one song, Heaven's Cove. But that's The Astonishing.